Nicholson, Director of Local Government from WSP, who's also the chair of one of our hot tanks, which are member-led think tanks we're running across the year, and John's chairing one that's looking at the future of commissioning. And finally by James Allen, who is Head of Public Services and Partnerships at NCVO, to give us a voluntary sector perspective. So let's start with Andrew.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everybody. Andrew Muter, I'm Chief Executive at Newark and Sherwood District Council. Newish to commissioning, I think, probably newer than some of you. And I wanted to give a perspective on commissioning as it appears from a district council point of view. Partly because I think commissioning has grown out of, in the local government world, a lot of thought about the delivery of personal social care. And there's lots of excellent practice that's evolved from that, and it's very useful. But when you put it in the context of some of the other services that we run in local government, particularly those that dominate our role in district councils, we're dealing with a lot of the issues that I think Catherine touched on earlier around universal services in the place, which carry a different kind of resonance from the kinds of services which are delivered to individuals around their own personal care. And I think that brings a slightly different nuance to the way we need to think about commissioning and the way the practice needs to work. So there's three sort of key challenges, I think, that I'd like to just bring to the fore in thinking about that sort of place-based commissioning. The first is around engagement, and we just heard a little earlier about what happens when you want to close a library. And engagement with communities is a very different, over the delivery of those sorts of facilities and place-based functions, is a very different issue than dealing with groups of users over particular needs and types of care. There is a lot of emotion involved, there's a lot of politics involved, and there's a lot of misplaced loyalty, particularly to bricks and mortar. And if I could exemplify that, I've got a councillor at the moment who would like not to recommission a leisure centre. He would like instead to just have lots of parks and open spaces where people can jog around and exercise. And he might well be right in outcome terms. In a commissioning dialogue, you might well say that's a perfectly reasonable set of outcomes to aspire to. We might get better outcomes for our communities if we have more open spaces, more ways to encourage a greater range of people to engage in their everyday lives with some outside activity and not concentrate our spending in a single leisure centre. But you put that into the context of a public dialogue with your users of the leisure centre, people in the community, you're not going to get such a sophisticated and dispassionate analysis of what's going on. So we need to think very carefully about engagement in commissioning around place-based services, and we need to spend time and effort on that if we're going to open up the idea of alternative ways of delivering outcomes for people. So that's the first challenge, and I think it's a challenge we haven't, certainly we haven't yet cracked completely. The second challenge in place-based services is that communities to me are very different in terms of their aspirations, even quite local communities. So if I tell you about the community of North Muscombe, which is a small village just north of Newark, they seem to me to have a particularly high intolerance of litter. They were very unhappy, complaining vociferously about the amount of litter. The reality is there's no more litter than most of our other communities. They get a similar, very good service in cleaning stuff up, but they are passionately opposed to litter. And in a commissioning sense, what that meant for us was engaging with them about how we could actually deliver something that matched their expectations. And their outcomes are different from other communities, so how do we work with them? And clearly the option for us to commission a higher grade service for them raises some issues of inequity. So in reality the solution for them has been about a sort of big society initiative, but supported by the council. So they do community litter picks, and we make sure that they are properly equipped. They have litter picks available to our volunteers. They organise it all, and we dispose of the litter afterwards. So they get their pristine community, which is much more litter-free than any other you will ever go to, and they are bought into the outcome as well. So some of our place-based commissioning has to recognise that differential in different communities. Different communities have different aspirations, requires different solutions. Those solutions have to be designed differently, and you need to think them through when you're talking about outcomes and how they're sought. So moving on from engagement and differentiation for different communities, we talked, I think, through Catherine about politics. Politics is there. You know, it's absolutely at the core of our business. And talking about delivering any new service through an external provider, be it privatised, through a private provider, or through some kind of community provision or shared service, is absolutely bound up with a political debate. And if we don't recognise that in the commissioning process, frankly, we are going to make mistakes. We're going to have disappointed people at the end of a process. And I think it's really important that providers, again, be they private providers or groups of voluntary organisations or whatever, recognise that politics is part of the mix. It's absolutely essential to have that planned in and thought through. And it can disrupt, you know, let's be honest, it can disrupt any commissioning process. And whereas I would imagine that you can keep politics out of very personal decisions in personal care, so politics can set the policy, but doesn't, you know, get politicians interfering in what a particular individual has decided to do in terms of their personal budget. That's sort of a no-no. Politics actually goes right the way down through place-based issues. So, you know, if you're talking about closing your local theatre because it's costing too much to subsidise, your politicians will be right down with their hands in the gravel because they understand how resonant that is with the public and how it could cost them their seats. So they will go further and deeper on place-based services. The third challenge for us, I think, is about granularity. So do we aggregate up lots of small services to make them attractive, to be able to commission them and create, as Simon is saying, a market? Is that our role in life, to aggregate up? Clearly for districts there is a big challenge here on some things, and many of us are looking at how do we collaborate with other neighbours to create a quantum of service that then can actually be re-engineered through the services of an external partner. You know, you take lots of little things that we have to spend money on. Street numbering and naming. You know, I employ 1.5 people doing that. It's not a particularly attractive contract, I suspect, to some of my friends on the panel. You know, we need to think about how are we aiming to aggregate those up and trying to make them more efficient? Is that the agenda? Or are we responding to the localist agenda? Are we actually trying to keep things even more granular so that we can engage local communities and co-produce with them and reduce costs that way? And both are potential solutions, but if you don't ask that question as part of your thinking about commissioning, the possibility is that you're going to get the answer very wrong. We've aggregated up through East Midlands Law Share. Councils in the East Midlands have a framework contract with a variety of law providers who work collaboratively with us and provide us with services on a call-off basis. And that's a very innovative and practical way in which we've extended our legal capacity through a shared arrangement. And that leads to lots of collaboration over joint training and that kind of thing, which wasn't there before. So there's added value in all of this. And finally, I guess my final reflection would be that commissioning is not just about a presumption around outsourcing. For me, recommissioning an in-house service is a valid outcome from the approach. We may be seeking different outcomes because traditionally we've provided services and they've been forever. We built libraries, you know, the implicit assumption is they're there forever. Now, actually, we need to get recommissioning into the DNA of what local government does because nothing is forever. We know the pace of change out there is such that services have to change over time. But we've created a public that expects stability and we maybe need to get the practice in to our thinking that involves changing things regularly, re-evaluating what we do across every service area. And of course, let's not forget decommissioning, because decommissioning is an essential part of this as well. And I suppose one question I would throw out in finally is, what's the provider involvement in helping us to decommission services?
Very interesting. John?
Simon, thank you. You would have wondered whether we'd been should be. Oh. You'd have been wondering whether Andrew and I had actually been talking and said, where you finish, I'll pick up. Start simply by saying that whilst I am chair of the NLGN pop tank on effective commissioning, these are my personal views, but I am working on them becoming NLGN views. So, but let's move too quickly. Let's start there. Yeah, Andrew finished by saying we should be thinking perhaps about what services to decommission, and my argument is going to be not, given that the topic was supposed to be about market shaping, I'm actually going to argue it shouldn't be market shaping but solution shaping, and that needs to start at very much, there's been the constant message this morning, the pre-procurement stage. So that means we need to be asking the question, just being asked, what services should we and should we not be providing? Who's going to do them and how? And then a crucial one, which I think tends to get left often to one side when talking about management approaches, is how we're actually going to make it happen in practice, and what can an effective delivery model be. And there's nothing surprising about this. Oh, it's moving far too quickly. Right, that was that. Right. Nothing surprising here about who is involved. The service commissioners, we've been talking about who might be the commissioning bodies, whether we're talking about police and fire, local authority, health. And I've used a couple of phrases there. I've tried to avoid private sector because I think it isn't necessarily private sector, it isn't necessarily fully commercial providers we're looking at. It's what I've called contracted providers, whether that's a tackle company, whether it's a community enterprise. And finally, in terms of the delivery groupings, the voluntary and community providers. And we'll hear an awful lot more about that very shortly. And of course, the fundamental one is the dialogue and the participants in the conversation about how services should be shaped and procured, shaped, commissioned and procured, must be customers, and that's come through very clearly this morning. So we'll now get to the slide you've all seen 2 or 3 times already, and we're trying to work out, and I'll talk it through a bit. Before we start thinking about how the market is shaped, I think it needs to just reflect a little bit about how services are delivered at present. And I've talked about the participants. If you think about the way that services patterns are delivering and emerging very much at the moment, there is the interface between the commissioners and the contracted providers, and there's the traditional contract usually coming in. There's also the implicit commissioning relationship between the commissioner and the voluntary community sector, and we've just heard that on the litter picking side, in the sense that quite often there is a decision that something will not be done by a commissioner because it can be picked up by the voluntary sector or community organisation. And there's also the relationship between the contracted provider and the voluntary and community providers on the basis that they often work together in terms of how they might deliver a service or support each other. The overlap in that Venn diagram, those sort of little lozenges on the overlaps, were probably relatively small in the past. But in the current climate, and certainly in what I'm afraid I refer to quite often as the low pay to no pay shift that is going to happen, with services that have been provided by people probably on minimum wage and whether it's in personal services or community services, a lot of those, as the hard decisions are made in future, are going to become the no-pay ones and the ones that have to be picked up by the voluntary sector. So I see those lozenges getting bigger, both between commissioners and the voluntary sector and between contracted providers and the voluntary sector. As that happens, that central area of the governance becomes absolutely crucial. It's not just what is done and who it's done by, but how that decision is made and how it's managed